afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You did not come to hear an introduction, you came to hear Mr. Gayden Wren. So I am not going to spend time introducing him, just going to say we're going to have a wonderful time in here. We'll be dismissed by 2:45 so that you can go in. I hope you all have your seats already reserved. They should be reserved for you. First, I want to introduce Ms. Jeanne Sasaki, the accompanist. And an excellent one. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Mr. Gayden Wren.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get started, just a reminder, the use of cameras, video cameras, and other recording equipment is strictly encouraged. Good afternoon. Welcome to Gilbert and Sullivan and me. I'm me, and I hope that our presentation this afternoon will be an agreeable way of passing the time until we get to very truly yours, Gilbert and Sullivan, which is why we're all here, including me. As she said, my name is Gayden Wren. There's diverse things I can tell you about myself. I have at present or at various points in the past been a theater director, a playwright, an actor, a singer, a dancer, a stand-up comedian, you probably got that already, a journalist, a teacher, a poet, an editor, a political speechwriter, a long time ago, a newspaper delivery boy, and I'm currently, among other things, a country singer and songwriter. Running through pretty much every aspect of my life is the constant strand of the operas of Gilbert and Sullivan, which is why I'm here today, why the Society asked me to come and talk to you. I, as you know, wrote Very Truly Yours, Gilbert and Sullivan, which we'll be seeing. I also wrote this book, A Most Ingenious Paradox, The Art of Gilbert and Sullivan. I also wrote another play called A Gilbert and Sullivan Christmas Carol. The Society didn't actually tell me what they wanted me to do this afternoon. They just said, they told me where I should be and when, and I was here, and I am. So I thought what I should do is talk a little bit about those three projects and sing a few songs to help pass the time. I've got some truly peculiar songs to offer you, which I think I have a couple things that even Rhythmic fail hasn't heard before. I aren't many of those. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Ms. Sasaki, our pianist, and my straight man over here in back will be stepping in periodically to assist. That out of the way, let's go to our first song. Our first song has music by Arthur Sullivan, so it's hard to go wrong, and words by one of the great Victorian masters of rhythm and rhyme, which I do not mean W.S. Gilbert. Instead, I mean the man who is my third or fourth favorite of the great Victorians, Mr. Rudyard Kipling. Now, Kipling and Sullivan wrote only one song together. It was a terrific hit, however, and there was talk of them writing an opera for the Savoy. Unfortunately, the song came out in the summer of 1900, and by the end of the year, Sullivan was dead. Come right in. Find yourself a chair.
There are chairs right over there. Come right in.
These people have been accommodating me in their house, so they definitely get to sit. I will have nowhere to sleep tonight if I don't. Absolutely. Oh, I hate to have him in here because just from his speaking voice, I can tell his singing voice is much better than mine. In any event, Sullivan died before he and Kipling could write the hypothetical opera together, so this was their only collaboration. It was, however, a tremendous success. To understand it, you need to know a little bit about the Boer War. I could quiz you on see how much you know, but I save us all some embarrassment. I'll tell you what you need to know. The Boer War, as you probably know, pitted the British Empire against the Dutch settlers in South Africa, who were known as the Boers. It's B-O-E-R-S, not R-E-S. Arguably, all you need to know about the Boer War is two linguistic facts. It is the first war known to have been described in print as a quagmire, and it is the war which contributed to the English language the term concentration camp. Initially, the British thought that it would be a short and glorious war. This is British Empire versus Dutch settlers. It doesn't sound like a very competitive match. So they were astonished when the first few battles in 1899 produced a resounding defeat for the British. They rallied. In 1900, they raised a new army which set sail for Table Bay, the main debarkation point in South Africa. And again, they expected a short, victorious campaign. They were therefore shocked and appalled when the casualty lists started coming back. The war would be nasty and brutish, but not short. It lasted until 1902/1903, and it was a pretty horrible thing, pretty much all considered. Winston Churchill said it was the worst and most appalling waste of life that he would ever encounter, and Churchill should know. Particularly shocking to the British public was a series of scandals that arose pretty much as soon as the soldiers had gone overseas. So there started to be a series of reports in the newspapers about soldiers' wives and children being thrown out of their homes, even sent to workhouses for debt, for the simple reason that the wage earner in the family was overseas fighting. The British newspapers then and now loved the scandal, so there were sensational reports of all of this. And one of the newspapers, the Daily Mail, founded a fundraising campaign to raise money to support the families of military personnel who were in need. And they commissioned Kipling and Sullivan to write what turned out to be The Absent-Minded Beggar. The idea was that it would be sung in the street by street singers who would collect money as donations to the cause. It turned out to be quite successful. The campaign was quickly named the Absent-Minded Beggar campaign. It earned £250,000, which is a good amount of money now. But in today's dollars, that would be $35 million. It was a staggering amount of money. The British public responded terrifically to this song. I should footnote just two things about this. The British loved to have a face for their enemy, and usually to refer to that person with condescending familiarity. In World War II, for example, the archenemy was Uncle Adolf. In World War I, it was Kaiser Bill. Not Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser Bill. The face of the Boer War was Paul Kruger, the president of the Dutch settlers' South African Republic. He turns up several times in the song, mostly referred to simply as Paul. And I should say a word on behalf of my friend Mr. Kipling, who is widely dismissed as a jingoistic tug thumper for British imperialism. This is highly unfair. Kipling was born in India, or as he would have said, India, and spent his formative professional years there as a reporter and short story writer. He had a much wider view of the world than the average Londoner did, and he was a sharp critic of Victorian society, particularly its hypocrisy, and a staunch supporter of the British rank-and-file soldier, the so-called Tommy, who he felt to be abused, overlooked, and taken for granted. And if you listen to the second verse of this song, you'll notice a very sharp riposte from Mr. Kipling to those who had suggested that any funds raised to benefit the women and children left behind by the soldiers should go only to their legal wives and their legitimate children. Which Mr. Kipling did not feel was entirely appropriate. So, if you will, cast yourself back. It is the summer of 1900. The beauty of being in Austin in February is it feels like the summer of 1900. You are walking the streets of London and you see a crowd gathered. And you're curious, so you push through to see what's going on. And in the middle you see a barrel organ and a street singer, a busker, who is going around singing a song that sounds something like this. When you shouted "Rule Britannia," when you sung "God Save the Queen," when you finished killing Kruger with your mouth, won't you kindly drop a shilling in my little tambourine for a gentleman in khaki ordered south? He's an absent-minded beggar and his weaknesses are great, but we and Paul must take him as we find him. He is out on active service something off a slate, and he's left a lot of little things behind him. Son, son, son of 100 kings, 50,000 horse and foot, going to Table Bay, each of them doing his country's work, and who's to look after the things? Pass the hat for your credit's sake and pay, pay, pay. There are girls he married secret, asking no permission to, for he knew he wouldn't get it if he did. And there's gas and coal and victuals and the house rent falling due, and it's more than rather likely there's a kid. There are girls he walked with casual, they'll be sorry now he's gone, for an absent-minded beggar they will find him. But it ain't the time for sermons with the winter coming on. We must help the girls that Tommy's left behind him. Son to son, son of a belted earl, son of a Lambeth publican, it's all the same today. Each of them doing his country's work, and who's to look after the girl? Pass the hat for your credit's sake and pay, pay, pay. There are families by thousands far too proud to beg or speak, and they'll put their sticks in bedding up the spout, and they'll live on half of nothing, paid them punctual once a week, 'cause the man that earned the wage is ordered out. He's an absent-minded beggar, but he heard his country's call, and his regiment didn't need to send to find him. He chucked his job and joined it, so the job before us all is to help the home that Tommy's left behind him. Job, cook's job, gardener, that room, use your house or paper shop, there's someone gone away. Each of them doing his country's work, and who's to look after the room? Pass the hat for your credit's sake and pay, pay, pay. Let us manage so as later we can look him in the face and can tell him what he very much prefer. That while he saved the empire, his employer saved his place, and his mates, that's you and me, look out for her. He's an absent-minded beggar, and he may forget it all, but we do not want his kiddies to remind him that we sent them to the workhouse while their daddy hammered Paul. So we'll help the homes our Tommy's left behind him. Home of a millionaire, 50,000 horse and foot, going to Table Bay, each of them doing his country's work, and what have you got to spare? Pass the hat for your credit's sake and pay, pay, pay. It's quite a rouser, isn't it? If you find yourself itching to reach into your pocket and donate money, the veterans of the Boer War and their families are long dead. There are a number of good charities that work to support American military families in the present day, many of whom scrape by on food stamps and that sort of thing. I particularly recommend the National Military Families Association, which has done good work for decades now. In any event, I promised to talk a little bit about my book, so how about we do that now? I started writing this book in 1984 with the idea that it would be released for Gilbert Sullivan's centennial in 1986. It was actually published by Oxford University Press in 2001. In other words, I missed my self-appointed deadline by approximately 15 years. Not characteristic of me, those who know me will tell you. However, the reason for this was fairly straightforward. Twice, in 1993 and again in 1997, I essentially tore up everything I had and started over. And I did this because I decided that in 1984 I didn't actually know very much about the Gilbert Sullivan operas, and that in the intervening years I hadn't learned that much. I had directed 9 of the operas by 1984, but looking back I felt I hadn't really done a very good job with it, largely because I didn't know what I was talking about. The problem was, what I knew about Gilbert and Sullivan was derived mainly from sing them on stage and read books about them. Which is all well and good, but I never paid much attention to the only really important source, which is the operas themselves. That's this one. The trouble is, if you see a great performance by an actor playing Coco, you naturally kind of think of that guy as Coco. Even years later, that's your vision of what Coco is. The trouble is, that's not what Gilbert's vision of Coco was. That's not what Sullivan's vision is, because they had no idea who that guy was. It's a real challenge to kind of step back and look at things without preconceived notions. And it took me a long time. It took me 15 years to get to the point where I felt I had actually thought about this stuff in such a way that sharing my thoughts with the world would be an act of presumption. I'll give you a little example of how this works. For this one, I'm going to need a volunteer from the audience. Is there somebody here who is reasonably familiar with the Mikado? Oh, good, shaking your head. I told you I wasn't going to call you. I'm looking for somebody who's familiar with the Mikado. It's an opera by Gilbert Sullivan. It's set in Japan. Anyone volunteer? I want to ask somebody 4 extremely simple questions. All right, excellent. Your name, please?
Eva.
Eva, nice. I'm Gayden Wren. Okay, this is just like a game show. I'm going to ask 4 questions. You don't have to worry about the first 2, right, because they're the simple ones that set it up. It's the last 2 are those ones that are potentially problematic. So, question number 1. The son of the Mikado of Japan has gone undercover as a wandering minstrel. I'm not going to ask you what his real name is. That's a trick question because we don't know. It's never revealed what that character's real name is. I'm instead going to ask, he pretends to be a wandering minstrel by the name of? What's the name? Oh, so it's a person who doesn't you want to step in? Okay, Nanky. Okay, excellent. Okay, first question. I agree with the answer to this question. But the second question is subtly trickier. How do we know how his name is pronounced, right? This is not likely named John or Steve. It could be pronounced Nankipu or Nankipu. How do we know? Not what do we think? No, oh, you will refrain from putting in your or? Okay, we got Nankipu. Excuse me? Yes, correct. He's got the point here. The point here is we can tell what Gilbert thought was the way this name is pronounced by the rhythm that he sets it to and that Sullivan does. Tis Nankipu. It's not tis Nankipu. Tis Nankipu. They have told us how it should be done. Now this only works for some of the characters in the opera because not every character's name is actually mentioned in the plot, but we know of a certainty that Nankipu's name is pronounced Nankipu. So our committee. My third question now is, I'll throw this open to the House, since clearly this is not going to be one of those one-on-one things between us. It's going to be a huge consultative thing. Okay, question number 3, which is where it starts to get tricky. He is in love with the ward of Coco, the Lord High Executioner. What is her name?
Oh, no!
You were so right, I shouldn't have called on you. Okay. Hold quiet, please. Is it one more time?
Yum, yum.
Okay, how do we know?
She sings it.
What does she sing?
Yum, yum.
One little maid's a bride, yum yum.
Yeah.
He yields his life if our yum yum surrender. When Sullivan sets it and when Gilbert puts it in scansion, they clearly want the name to be pronounced Yum Yum.
Yes.
Nonetheless, if you see it on stage today, almost all Americans and indeed almost all English will call her Yum Yum, which is particularly weird because it's derived, obviously it's a little kid thing, Yum Yum. You don't say, I love that Yum Yum. You say, I like that Yum Yum. And you look through it. For he's going to marry Yum Yum, Yum Yum. Now, how many people have seen a production of the Mikado in which she was called Yum Yum? I certainly have. Every production I've ever seen, that wasn't directed by me, called her Yum Yum. Nonetheless, if you actually look at the stuff, it's clear that somewhere along the line, what Gilbert intended and what Sullivan intended has simply been changed. Not deliberately. Somebody didn't say we're going to, henceforward, Rafe Rack Straw is going to be called Rafe Rack Straw. It just evolved in a different way, and people saw other productions and said, well, I know how this is pronounced because I saw it done last year in Shropshire, and that was the way they pronounced it there, so that's the way we'll pronounce it here. But if you look back at the stuff and you come at it without a preconceived notion, I was in probably 200 performances of the Mikado before this aspect of it occurred to me. It's very hard to step back and look at it. Nonetheless, that is what my book is like. It is about looking at the opera as closely as you can. Now, my advice to you is to read both of these books. However, if you're going to read only one, my advice to you is to read this one. This is the one you need to read, really think about it or whatever. You'll discover all the things that I think, and probably some other things that didn't occur to me that will occur to you. Gilbert and Sullivan is the best source to understand Gilbert and Sullivan. It really is. Okay, joke.
Say, how many GNS buffs does it take to change a light bulb?
How many GNS buffs does it take to change a light bulb? Oh, that's the traditional bulb. We never changed that. Okay. So the thing about Yum Yum is the result of a study of rhythm. W.S. Gilbert, like Rudyard Kipling, was an acknowledged master of rhythm. He was particularly admired for the diversity of his rhythms. Arthur Sullivan said in an interview one time that Gilbert gave him an infinite variety of rhythms, which always inspired new musical ideas. This was his explanation of how, after decades of working together, they could still come up with stuff that was fresh and sparkling, that Gilbert never gave him the same rhythms twice. And in fact, in the entire 14 operas of Gilbert and Sullivan, there is only one song, other than opening numbers, which is to the scansion of an existing song from the operas. And I can already see the wheels start to turn in people's head. It's very hard because there's dozens of songs in every one of the 14 operas. I will come back to this later and tell you what it is. In the meantime, I'd rather focus on the fact that, if you were listening carefully, you heard me say, except for the opening numbers. Because there's an unusual aspect to the opening numbers of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas that you have to have done a lot of them to notice. Will you give us a shot, please? Good.
I'm fine.
That's needed, fine. 1, 2. Pour the pirate sherry, fill the pirate glass, and to make us more than merry, let the pirate bumper pass. For today our pirate prentice rises from indenture stream. Strong his arm and keen his scent is, he's a pirate now indeed. You see what I did there? For those who are counting, the words are from the Pirates of Penzance, the music is from HMS Pinnacle. Interesting. Let's try another one. Gentlemen of Japan, on many of us a jar, on many a screen and fan. We figure in lively paint, our attitude is queer and quaint. You're wrong if you think it ain't, you're wrong if you think it ain't. It is a strange thing that Mr. Gilbert, who was incredibly diverse in his lyrics otherwise, would set so many songs to exactly the same scansion. Now, Sullivan does different things with them, but Gilbert gives it in exactly the same thing. Now, for my next trick, I've conducted a scientific study of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, looking for the silliest tune for any of the opening numbers. Ready? Let's rock. Hark the hour of 10
Angelina, and when sued by Angelina, surely will appear. Rewind. Ring forth the bells with clarion sound, forget your knells for joys abound. Forget your notes of mournful lay, and from your throats pour joy today. For today, young Alexis Poindexter is betrothed to Aline, sang the show. Rewind. We sail the ocean blue, and our saucy ships of beauty. We are sober men and true, and attentive to our duties. When the balls whistle free or the bright blue sea, we stand to our guns all day. Rewind. Pour the pirate's sherry, fill the pirate glass. And to make us more than merry, let the pirate bumper pass. For today our pirate princess rises from indenture's free, strong his arm and keen his sentence. He's a pirate now indeed. Rewind. 20 lovesick maidens we, lovesick all against our will. 20 years hence we shall be 20 lovesick maidens still. 20 lovesick maidens we, and we die for love of thee, and we die for love of thee, and we die for love of thee. Rewind. Tripping hither. Rewind. Search throughout the panorama for a sign of royal dama, who today should cross the water with his fascinating daughter. Rewind. If you want to know who we are gentlemen of Japan. On many a vase and jar, on many a screen and fan, we figure not we paint our actions, we're quite wrong if you think it ain't, if you think it ain't. Oh, hold it. I do this occasionally as a party entertainment, cast parties and that sort of thing. Somebody said to me a while back, well, it doesn't really fit. You kind of squeezed it in. He said, if you want to know who we are. I said, when he thought about it, you could see him thinking, if you want to know who we are, I didn't squeeze it in. Squeeze it in. Rewind! Fair as rose as bright May day, soft as rose as warm west wine, sweet as rose as new mown hay, rose as queen of maidenkind, rose all blushing with virgin blushes say, is anyone going to marry you today? Rewind! When maiden love she sits and sighs, she wanders to and fro, unbidden teardrops fill her eyes, and to all questions she replies. Rewind! List and learn, ye dainty roses, roses white and roses red. Why we bind you into posies, there your morning bloom has fled, by a love maiden's making essence of a heart that's aching, even though that heart we break,
My own theory as to why they did it this way is essentially superstition. There were certain things that Gilbert and Sullivan did because they had always been successful with them, and after you have 2 or 3 shows that are hit with that scansion as your first one, it kind of becomes what you do. It is striking that there are literally hundreds of songs, and there's one that isn't an opening number that's repetitive, and there's 13 that are opening numbers that are repetitive. It's a striking thing. Does it have anything substantially meaningful to say about the operas? No. But it's a great party trick. And if you'll excuse me for just a moment, I'll deal with one of the consequences. Until I was like 13, I could sing that song in its proper register, but since then, not so much. Okay, joke please.
Hey Gayden, how many GNS buffs does it take to change a light bulb?
Oh, 21. 1 to hold the bulb and 20 lovesick maidens to sing, turn, oh turn. I told you, I used to be a stand-up comedian. These things bob to the surface. I have studied the Gilbert and Sullivan opera's rhythm very closely for another reason. I am the author of the show Gilbert and Sullivan Christmas Carol, which I mentioned. This show is Dickens's classic story told with Sullivan's music with my words. Now, some years ago, somebody said to me, it should be called a Wren and Sullivan Christmas Carol. And I said, well, that would be unfair to Gilbert. It would also be commercial suicide, but we'll set that aside. Because, well, yes, the words are mine, but the music is Sullivan's, and Sullivan built his music on the rhythms, the scansons that were given to him by Gilbert. So, yes, I put the flesh on the bones, but the skeleton, if you will, is by Gilbert. What does this sound like? Well, here's a song from that show. It's from early in the show. It's sung by a character who may be familiar, named Ebenezer Scrooge.
If you give me your attention, I will tell you what I am. I'm a well-regarded banker, one who hasn't time for sham. Each payment to the penny I'm entitled to expect. From my overburdened debtors I endeavor to collect. Some winter that is Christmas, even so. They'll come up with my interest or go out into the snow. But to build up my investors, I do everything I can. So if everybody says that I'm a hard and heartless man, well, I couldn't care less. To fundraisers and benefits I turn a stone deaf ear, and people seeking alms no better than to come in here. A charitable notion I can readily rebuff. I may have a lot of money, but I've never had enough. I know my income to the penny, and I keep it for my own. Whatever good it may do will be for myself alone. But my shareholders have prospered since the day I first began. So if everybody says that I'm a hard and heartless man, well, I couldn't care less. I'm sure I'm not a miser, I invest most readily. I'll gladly spend $2 million if I know I'll get back 3. I've a nose for an investment, I've an eye for picking stock. I've a taste for undervalued firms which may be on the block. I have an ear for inside rumors, for a bond that may be junk. I can rescue ailing companies and sell them chunk by chunk. But to bolster the economy, however much I plan, still everybody says that I'm a hard and heartless man. Well, I couldn't care less. I couldn't care less.
I'm keeping track of the time because I don't want to incur the wrath of Rafe by running over our time. I promised to tell you a little bit about Very Truly Yours, Gilbert and Sullivan. So here's how I came to write this particular play, which is the only one of the 10 or 15 plays that I've written that's about real-life people. In doing the research for my book, I read practically every existing book on Gilbert and Sullivan, both individually and as a duo. I also watched all of the movies about them and read a number of plays about them. And some of these were excellent, and some of them not so excellent. I particularly recommend Stedman on Gilbert and Jacobs on Sullivan, and Mike Lee's Brilliance Topsy-Turvy. However, I found in all of them a common problem. They focused mainly on the conflict between Gilbert and Sullivan. Now, I get that. You know, I'm a playwright myself, and we all know that conflict is a source of good drama. When the cowboy in the white hat meets the cowboy in the black hat, you want them to shoot it out, not to turn out to be old college chums. Tolstoy famously wrote that all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. He might have just as well said, all happy families are boring, but every unhappy family is interesting. So, I get it. The trouble is, I don't think it's a good paradigm to use in writing about Gilbert and Sullivan. The facts of the matter are this. Gilbert and Sullivan first collaborated in 1871. They last collaborated in 1896, a span of exactly 25 years. During this time, they were estranged from one another for a little bit less than 2 years. First due to the so-called lozenge quarrel, which is chronicled in Topsy-Turvy, and second due to the so-called carpet quarrel, which is the main subject of the earlier movie, The Great Gilbert and Sullivan. Now, what that means is to be representative, somebody writing a book, play, or movie about Gilbert and Sullivan should be roughly 8.5% conflict and 91.5% cooperation. More important, we don't really care about the conflict between Gilbert and Sullivan. We care about the cooperation, the collaboration. During the 91.5% of the time that they were in general agreement, they wrote the 14 operas, 2 songs, and 1 cantata that are their legacy today. During the 8.5%, they didn't write anything with each other. The things they wrote with other people mainly flopped and are deservedly unknown today. It's the operas they wrote together that are interesting and important. So I decided to write something about Gilbert and Sullivan that would be about their collaboration, because that's what I find interesting. How they worked, what each one brought to the partnership, and how their miraculous operas came to be created. I could have written it as a biography or a novel or a screenplay, but I'm a playwright, so I wrote it as a play. That is the whole point of Very Truly Yours, Gilbert and Sullivan. I've now saved you the necessity of seeing it. Unfortunately, I believe you've already paid for your tickets. In other words, my royalties are safe. All right, we got a little more time, so how about 2 or 3 more songs? I mentioned earlier that I'm currently a country singer, among other things. I work under the name of Tennessee Walt. This is a relatively new thing in my life, the last year or 2, and many of my Gilbert and Sullivan friends have asked me, well, how do you get from Gilbert and Sullivan to Hank Williams, from Iolanthe to Johnny Cash? Well, as I said, Gilbert and Sullivan runs pretty much through every aspect of my life. And my 41 years of doing Gilbert and Sullivan proves useful in all kinds of contexts. Now consider this song, for example, which is by an Australian who was popularized by a Canadian. Oh, can't be Tennessee Walt without my hat. I was toting my pack along the dusty Winnemucca Road when along came a semi with a high-end canvas-covered load. If you're going to Winnemucca, Mac, with me you can ride. So I climbed up in the cab and then I settled down inside. He asked me if I had seen a road with so much dust and sand, and I said, listen, bud, I've traveled every road in this here land. I've been everywhere, man, I've been everywhere, man. I've crossed the deserts bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. The travel I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere. It's Reno, Chicago, Fargo, Minnesota, Buffalo, Toronto, Windsor, Sarasota, Wichita, Tulsa, Iowa, Oklahoma, Tampa, Panama, Manila, Napo, Hank Snow. Fun fact, Hank Snow in his youth was a door-to-door lobster salesman.
You want just one more of these?
Yeah, sure. We'll do the peculiar one at a good brisk tempo. You may have heard that there's a company in New York City that performs Gilbert and Sullivan in Yiddish. What you may not realize is this company goes back to, I should have a blue jacket for this one, shouldn't I? Goes back to 1978, and you are looking at the original Schleimer the Schlemiel. You think a Yiddish version of Dick Deadeye in the Yiddish version of HMS Pinafore, which back then was called Der Shears. I learned this show entirely phonetically because I'm not Jewish. I've never spoken a word of Yiddish in my life. And believe me, when you learn something phonetically, it sticks with you. I last appeared in the show in something like 1982. And if somebody started playing it today, I could jump right into it. Wir fuhren über den Jam, unser Schiff ist doch ein Schiffkeit. Wir seien angenommen und gezweit zu unserer Arbeit. Wenn die Pfeifen nehmen bloßen zu einer starken Metlosen, wir seien uns sehr Feuer. Was tun wir zu wissen, wenn der Dixon nehmen schissen? Wir schreien alle Schweine Israel. Ahoy, ahoy, die Pfeifen nehmen bloßen. Ahoy, ahoy, die Pfeifen nehmen bloßen. Wir seien die beste Matrosen. Wir fuhren über den Jam, unser Schiff ist doch eine Schiffkeit. Wir seien angenommen und gezweit zu unserer Arbeit. Unser Schiff ist doch eine Schiffkeit. Wir lieben unsere Arbeit. Wir seien angenommen, wir fuhren über den Danke. Okay, I promise, got one last song for you. I promise I said there was one song in all of Gilbert and Sullivan that was written to the scansion of a previously existing one. And I could see the wheels turning and see Ray Fail thinking, I must know this. What is it? In any event, I'm not going to send you off to Very Truly Yours mystified, so here's that song. A king, as I've been told, in the wonder working days of old, when hearts were twice as good as gold and 20 times as mellow. Good temper triumphed in his face, and in his heart he found a place for all the erring human race, and every wretched fellow, and every wretched fellow. So to the top of every tree, promoting everybody. Now that's the kind of king for me. He wished all men as rich as he. He wished all men as rich as he. Rich as he. This stern decree you'll understand caused great dismay throughout the land. For young and old and shy and bold were equally affected. The youth who winked a roving eye, who breathed the non-connubial sigh, was thereupon condemned to die. He usually objected, and you'll allow, as I expect, that he was right to so object. And I am right, and you are right, and all is quite correct. Correct, yes, all is quite correct. And you'll allow, as I expect, that he was right to so object. And I am right, and you are right, and all is quite correct. This king, although no one denies his heart was of abnormal size, yet he'd have acted otherwise if he had been a cuter. The end is easily foretold.
blessed thing you hold is made of silver or of gold. You long for simple pewter, for pewter, for pewter. You long for simple pewter. When you have nothing else to wear, bust cloth of gold and satins rare. For cloth of gold you cease to care. Of gold's the price of shoddy. In short, whoever you may be, to this conclusion, you'll agree when everyone is somebody. No one's anybody.
Thank you for giving me your attention and letting me tell you what I am. Let's go see a play.